If you're as ignorant as I am, you probably think that the racist problem in South Africa, Southern Africa, started maybe 15, 20, 50 years ago. No. 275 years ago, 1717, the seeds of apartheid were sown in South Africa by the Dutch East India Company. The reason being that the Dutch East India Company was a trading company on its way to India and disembarked to get water and this and that in South Africa. And they'd begun to spread out, plantations were formed and so on, but they were running out of labor. The question arose, what kind of labor did they want? They had a number of Dutch, a number of Germans, a number of French there, but these people were getting a little uppity, demanding civil rights from the Dutch East India Company, which did not want to grant them. So there was a vote taken. It was 22-1 in favor of no more European settlers. The question is, what do they do for labor? Oh, they said, that's very simple. We will simply enslave the Bantu, the Hottentots, and the Bushmen, which is what they did. That was the end for 100 years of European immigration to Southern Africa. Today, we begin to see a little movement. And our speaker tonight is going to talk to us about that. He's going to talk about challenges and opportunity in Southern Africa. So who is this man who's going to talk to us? Who is Geoffrey David Out? He spent 21 years in the Foreign Service, most of it focused on Southern Africa. He served in South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia. He was ambassador to Zambia. He studied at Harvard, at the University of Massachusetts, University of Minnesota. He's written a book called A Peace in Southern Africa, which may be optimistic, but maybe he'll explain why it's reality. Mr. Ambassador, we await you with great intention, sir.
Thank you very much. I am impressed by the turnout, but I suspect you're here for the view. I will try to impede your view as little as possible, and I hope you'll bear with me tonight because I don't have a prepared text. I think I could have had one, but I find such things rather tedious, at least when I deliver them. So what I'd like to do is talk first about what's happening in Africa generally, then with some specific reference to American policy toward Africa, and then finally what's happening in Southern Africa. And by Southern Africa, I mean the country of South Africa, which is much in the news, but also the surrounding nations, including and specifically Angola and Mozambique, two former Portuguese colonies where there's some very interesting developments. And let me begin. First, let me also say that there are maps that have been passed out, and I hope they're fairly widely scattered. I guess they're not. But one should not feel embarrassed that one cannot immediately find Burkina Faso or pinpoint Ouagadougou. The fact of the matter is that Africa is generally not well known to our society, our country. I think this is unfortunate, but I think it's also a sign of great interest that so many of you have come here, and I think it is a sign of where we are heading in terms of American knowledge and interest in Africa. Let me make a very broad opening statement, which I'll be prepared to sustain, and I hope in my speech, but also in questions and answers. And let me also say, I hope to get quickly to questions. I always feel it helps to give you hope at the beginning. Africa is in the middle of a major revolution. I call it the Second African Revolution. The first revolution occurred in the 50s and early 60s when in a relatively brief period of time, certainly less than a decade, colonialism ended in Africa. And we had first with the Gold Coast, which became Ghana, and then in rapid succession, 30, 40, almost 50 new countries appeared on the map as Britain and France and Portugal, Belgium, even Spain, retreated from a period of colonialism which had really in itself only been a fairly brief period. My introducer was correct in talking about European interposition in Africa dating back to the 18th, 17th, even 16th century. But in point of fact, colonialism in Africa lasted a relatively short period of time, basically from about the 1880s to the 1950s. Historically, a blink of an eye. So that was the first African revolution, and if you, like me, remember that, there was great hope, great promise, great excitement. And indeed, the first revolution in Africa had one result which had little to do with Africa itself, but had a great deal to do with our own society, our own culture, because the independence of African states, the arrival in this country of African diplomats, who, when I was growing up, and if you remember the 50s, there was a story in the newspaper almost every day of some indignity that an African diplomat had suffered because of segregation. And somehow, in our sort of twisted way of thinking, insulting a foreigner, one foreigner bothered a whole lot more people than insulting millions of our fellow citizens. But the introduction of free African states seems to me to have played a significant role in our own civil rights movement. So this revolution took place, was welcomed by the world, colonialism was dead, and the revolution failed. And this, I think, is something that we have been generally loath to say in this country, in Western Europe generally, because anything that has to do with Africa, anything that has to do with race is so sensitive, so neuralgic that we tread around it very carefully. But the fact of the matter is that the first African revolution failed. Why did it fail? Because in country after country, many of which did not have the requisite personnel to run a modern society, and many of which the leadership were captivated by concepts of state control and socialism that they had learnt at the Sorbonne and at the London School of Economics, and yes, indeed, at Harvard and Stanford and elsewhere, turned these African states into highly centralized, state-controlled societies in which, as elsewhere, when the economy is controlled, the political life became controlled, and democracy did not flourish in Africa. In fact, it was stifled, and in country after country, we had during the 50s and the 60s and the 70s and until the early 80s and even into the late 80s, one-party states. Now, there was some justification for this, and I can answer questions about that if you want, but basically, the promise of African liberation of that first revolution was taken away from the African people. Small urban elites controlled the economy, usually through state bureaucracies, the parastatals. Small African countries would have 100 parastatals, including some not only that would be running steel mills, but others that would be running laundry shops or restaurants. And the small urban elite would also control through a one-party system that clamped down on dissent, clamped down on freedom of opinion, freedom of association. Well, we are now going through a second African revolution, and I think those of us who follow Africa are as excited now about what's happening as the people who followed Africa back in the 50s and 60s. I hope that our hopes and our dreams will not be crushed as they were before. And I think there's reason to believe that they won't be. And I'll talk about that a bit. But what do I mean by a second African revolution? A number of factors have played a part in this. Starting in the early and mid-'80s, it became more and more apparent to leadership in Africa and to the international community, which provides a great deal of international financial assistance to Africa, that the statist economies had dug themselves so deeply into holes that they could not dig themselves out. The level of debt, the level of state corruption, the level of economic growth, and by that I mean negative economic growth, became so apparent that country after country started to turn, with the help of donors and with the help of the International Monetary Fund, that is the international donor community, to more rational economic policies. And what we have seen in Africa over the last 7 to 8 years are governments that are shedding themselves of parastatals, governments that are introducing comprehensive changes to their economy, such as legitimate, reasonable exchange rates, governments that are trying to cut the size of their bloated civil service. And these changes, by the way, are extraordinarily painful. But they're going on, and there is hope in Africa. There are African economies that have bottomed out and are on the way up. That process had been ongoing, as I say, since the early mid-'80s, when the change in international politics, in world events, the collapse of communism, had a profound effect on Africa. Because although there were very few African states that ever proclaimed themselves as Marxist-Leninists, I can only think of 3 or 4, the Soviet model of a one-party system in control of the economy and the political life of the country was prevalent throughout the continent, whether they were communist or not. And when that system began to crumble, in Eastern Europe, it crumbled in Africa as well. And here's one of the differences that I think is important between what happened in the 50s and 60s and what is happening now. Over that 30-year period, notwithstanding the problems of African economies, there has developed in most African societies an educated, urban elite not connected with government, or if connected with government, better, more internationalized in their views. A lot more people who have studied abroad. A lot more people who have studied in their own countries. Keep in mind, and you've heard this statistic before, that when Zaire, the Belgian Congo, that tremendous country, larger than the United States east of the Mississippi, when it got its independence in the early 60s, there were less than 12 college graduates in the entire country. But that's changed. There are thousands now, trained there, trained in the States, trained in Europe. There are many more businessmen. There weren't many businessmen in many colonial societies because the colonialists kept a lock on it. So the failure, to go back, of that first revolution was, as the colonialists left, they sort of dumped on cultures that they had not prepared or not allowed themselves to prepare for what we would call liberal democracy. They dumped on those cultures systems of government, basically in Anglophone Africa, Westminster models of parliaments and courts and what have you, that were not supported by the culture itself, and perhaps inevitably it failed. But now that's changed, and now there is in Africa a large percentage of people, a body of people who can make democracy work. And so As the state lost its control over the economy, as things loosened up there, as Eastern Europe went the way that we're all glad it went, these new thinkers in Africa have taken over. Throughout the 1980s, for instance, of the, let's say, 50 countries, 48 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and by that when I speak of Africa, I'm not talking, by the way, of North Africa, Egypt, Morocco, and Tunisia. I'm talking about sub-Saharan. Of those countries, only 5 could legitimately have been called democracies. Within the last 18 months alone, 3 countries that I can mention, Benin, Cape Verde, Zambia, have had elections in which the rulers of more than 10, 15, 20, 25 years were turned out. First multi-party elections, probably since independence, or since right after independence. 4/5, that is 40 of those 50 countries, are going through some form of democratic transition right now. Between now and the end of the year, there are going to be at least a dozen major elections in Africa. And the excitement on that continent is palpable. I travel there fairly frequently, and it is a new world. And it's in some ways too bad that so much else is happening in the world, such cataclysmic events, that this second African revolution is not getting the kind of attention that it really warrants and deserves. But there is no sense complaining about that. That's just a fact of life, and we have to deal with that. So we are in a revolutionary period in Africa. What's the United States doing about it? I think the first important thing to say is the United States cannot impose itself or its ideas or its will on Africa. But we can work with Africans who share our ideals about economic liberalism and political pluralism. And that's what we're doing. Our aid programs to Africa, which have maintained their level, notwithstanding the great pressure on our budget and on our desire to help Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union, those aid levels, that assistance we give to Africa, increasingly is designed to help African countries restructure their economies. It is designed, increasingly, not only to help those societies meet basic human needs, schooling, health, but to help promote a private sector. And often that's as easy as setting up trust funds where a fellow can come in and borrow $200 to get a sewing machine. And unlike many debtors in this country, they actually pay back, which is very encouraging. Or it can be something very major, like helping a country through a very difficult balance of payments problem as it revalues its currency. So economically, our assistance to Africa is designed to promote this kind of economic liberalization. Let me just make a parenthesis here. When I talk about assistance, I'm talking about development assistance, which is about $800 million a year, which sounds like a goodly sum, but when you parcel it out among 45 countries or 40 countries, it's not so much. That does not include humanitarian assistance, and I think we as a nation have nothing to be embarrassed about, nothing to be ashamed about. We lead the world in responding to drought and famine and disaster. And I just came from a conference in Geneva where, in response to a truly horrible drought in southern Africa, which again has not, I think, gotten the publicity it warrants, the United States was able to pledge about $300 million in assistance. Most of that, I should add, because we are Americans, is corn and wheat that we've bought from American farmers, and everybody will benefit from it, particularly the American farmers, but that's okay. But that is not part of the 800 million I'm talking about. What else we are trying to do in terms of political liberalization is through word and deed encourage those people who are promoting democracy in Africa. Now, one has to be careful. We're talking about foreign cultures. We're talking about states we have relations with. It is not diplomatic, to use that term, to go in and tell country X or the leader of country X, you've been on this throne long enough, get the heck off. But we can work with groups. We can work with liberal opposition elements. We can, when elections are held, sponsor independent organizations that can verify and monitor elections. We can have an active interchange program in which we bring African lawyers, in which we bring African women who are running women's organizations to this country. And I'm sure many of you have met them as they go through Baltimore or other cities, and some of you have probably entertained some in your home. There's a lot that we can do. And increasingly, we are factoring in to our entire policy in Africa what we as a nation can do to help promote liberalization without engaging in a new form of imperialism, which is to tell African leaders and African states what they must do. But all of this is taking place in a situation of endemic conflict. And this is the great flaw in Africa, that the continent at any given time is plagued by internal insurrections, by wars between nations, by violence. And that's harder to deal with. And as long as that violence continues, as long as there is that kind of conflict, the kind of economic and political development that we would like to see, and that Africans increasingly would like to see themselves, is that much more difficult. So one of the elements of our diplomacy, one of the major elements of American foreign policy, it's a sort of a three-legged stool. One is economic liberalization, one is political liberalization, and the third is conflict resolution. And we in the State Department and other elements of the U.S. government are actively involved in trying to promote resolutions to conflicts in Africa. And this is where, let me use that to talk about Southern Africa, because it is an area which has seen horrific conflict over the past decades. In Angola and Mozambique, the Portuguese, who were, I think, probably the least enlightened of colonists, perhaps the Belgians were worse. They can fight it out amongst themselves. But the Portuguese, when they left their colonies, and they had several in Africa, but the two largest were Mozambique and Angola, left them in horrible shape. And in Angola, they were unable to work out an arrangement that could hold among competing forces, guerrilla forces, that had been fighting the Portuguese. And so those guerrilla forces started to fight amongst themselves. This is 1974, 1975. And you know some of the names, particularly, for instance, Jonas Savimbi, who's still fighting, or is not fighting now. He's running for election, and that's the story. That's the triumph. The war in Angola has been a dreadful war. I don't know how many tens, perhaps hundreds of thousands of people have been killed. It was also a war which got entwined in our competition with the Soviet Union. And without going into details, you'll remember that the Soviets sent up to 50,000 surrogate Cuban troops to Angola. 50,000. The largest expeditionary force that had ever landed in Africa. And we, as basically part of the Reagan doctrine, which saw us try to stop Soviet encroachment in places like, usually by surrogate, but often directly in places like Afghanistan and Cambodia and Angola. We got involved in that war too. And we, through a program which was supposed to be secret, but I don't think anybody who cares ever kept it a secret, we were supporting Jonas Savimbi. And over the course of the years, I'd like to tell you, a fair amount of your tax money went to support Savimbi's war against the Cubans who were propping up a regime in Angola which essentially hijacked that first African revolution. Well, the end of the Cold War has enabled us, through our diplomacy, through the people who I have had great fortune to work for, and some of the names may be familiar to you, people like Chester Crocker, who was Assistant Secretary for Africa, or my current boss, Hank Cohen, to negotiate the withdrawal of Cuban troops from Angola, to negotiate the independence of Namibia, and now to have negotiated a peace settlement in Angola, which will result in late September in elections in which Jonas Savimbi is one of the candidates, the government, the current president is another candidate. And it is our hope that this process of political liberalization that we've seen elsewhere in Africa, this drive towards freedom, will take root in Angola. In Mozambique, it's a tragic country. What happened in Mozambique was that it got its independence in 1974-75. It immediately, as a black government, began helping the black rebels who were fighting against the white regime in Rhodesia of Ian Smith. Well, Rhodesia sorted itself out in 1979, 1980. It's now Zimbabwe, an independent state. That violence stopped. We, I think, as a country, played a role in helping to negotiate that end as well. But Smith, to counter the help that the Mozambicans were giving to his enemies, founded a guerrilla movement to fight the government of Mozambique. And even though Smith disappeared, that guerrilla movement took on a life of its own. And that war is still going on. The guerrillas are called Renamo, the government's called Frelimo. There are currently, today, in Rome, negotiations being mediated by the Italian government, by the Vatican, and by us. And I hope that war will end, because it has been violent and bitter. And what is happening in southern Africa right now is this drought I talked about, in which, if we cannot get food to these people, hundreds of thousands will die in Mozambique alone. Now, South Africa. Perhaps I have to talk less about South Africa because you all know so much about it, because it's in the papers. Again, what is happening in South Africa is unique. The system of government, apartheid, the racial balance, everything about that country is unique. But yet, it is nevertheless part of this great African economic development, or I should say political development, this movement towards democracy. And after years of war, and after years of international criticism and condemnation, the South African government finally was taken over by a leader, Mr. de Klerk, who has shown more foresight, more wisdom. He is still a product of his time and his culture. Let's not be mistaken about that. But he is a leader. And he did the right thing. He released Nelson Mandela from 27 years in prison. And there is a process of negotiation going on in that country. The civil war which had begun in South Africa has largely ended. There's still terrific violence in that country, and it has many roots. But negotiations are underway, and I am confident that within the coming months we will see a transitional government put in place in South Africa that will have blacks and whites in it. And then within a relatively short period of time we will see elections that will elect a black government there. So let me conclude by saying that there's a great deal happening in Africa. I have stressed tonight the positive. I could as easily talked about the negative. I could talk about the great poverty. I could talk about the scourge of AIDS. I could talk about the violence that continues, about the wars that haven't been resolved, about the countries that are falling apart, like Somalia, for instance, or Sudan. But I prefer, not because I'm a flack or a hack or a propagandist, but because I think you as concerned citizens have the right to know that in that part of the world, which we don't spend a whole lot of time thinking about or talking about or reading about, there are developments which are consistent with what we hope for the world in terms of freedom of people and ability of people to live at peace with themselves, and that our policies are contributing to those positive developments. And I think over the next decade, Africa has the chance for a new flowering based on this second African revolution. And I think we as a country owe it to them and owe it to ourselves to do what we can to help them. Thank you.
Well, we thank you very much for a very comprehensive and positive statement. The floor is now open for questions until 10 minutes after 7. The question was, why can't the states of Africa, 45 in number, consolidate in some way to reduce the total numbers?
Actually, that is an excellent question. So many of the boundaries of African states are arbitrary. They were administrative districts of the various colonial regimes, often cutting across logical lines of ethnic affinity, often decided about simply as a function of European politics. There are chunks of Africa, Queen Victoria in particular, used to make gifts of little bits of Africa to the Kaiser and to others. Just, as a sort of a token, coming to visit here, you can have this place. And when the colonial period ended, the one thing that Africans agreed upon themselves was, we will not change our borders. In fact, that is enshrined in the Declaration of the Organization of African Unity. Because if borders were open to change, then it would be Katie bar the door. Because every state in Africa would have multiple claims on every other surrounding state. But what you're suggesting is a unification of Africa. Unfortunately, or fortunately, I think history will tell, the trend is in the opposite direction. Because what we see in Africa is greater and greater emphasis in some countries on ethnic politics, on the division of the state into smaller states, such as has happening in Europe. Look at Yugoslavia. Look at what might happen in Czechoslovakia or the former Soviet Union. This is unfortunate because these economies are still so weak. It seems to me that if they are fractionated even further, they will suffer more. It is another reason, I think, that African states should move very quickly to democracy. Because it seems to me that it is only two kinds of systems that can really keep a divergent state together. One is a real authoritarian regime. And those are disappearing in Africa. The people aren't going to put up with them. And the other is a democratic system in which each person or each ethnic group feels that they have something to be gained by being a part of the political system. And that's another reason why the democratic thrust in Africa is so important right now. But to answer your question, I don't see the prospects of unification or reduction in the number of states. To the contrary, I think it might go in the other direction. We already have one state in Africa which is literally dissolved. That's Somalia, which basically has no central government to speak of right now.
Would you comment on the AIDS problem?
The AIDS problem in Africa is critical. I won't even say serious. It's beyond serious. Basically, if you trace a line from East Africa downward, from Kenya, Tanzania, Uganda, Zambia, Zimbabwe, into South Africa, Malawi, a few other countries, you have endemic AIDS. In Lusaka, where I was ambassador, over 25% of the people who were brought to the central hospital in town, of adults, tested positive for AIDS, for HIV. Now that's 25%. In the most effective communities in the United States, it's 0.001, or let's say 1 out of 1,000. In Africa, we're talking about 25 out of 100 in some communities. It is a particularly pernicious disease because it strikes most at the most productive elements of African society. It's largely heterosexually transmitted, most significantly through prostitutes in urban centers or along truck routes, and largely contracted by those elements of African society that have some surplus income. Now, for us, it may not be a whole lot of surplus income to be able to go out and buy a few beers on Friday night and rent a woman for 15 minutes, but that is what's happened. And so you see in the what constitutes the middle urban class, which is not the same as our middle class, but clerks, bank clerks, government civil servants, teachers, truck drivers, others who have steady income and perhaps some surplus. You see the disease affecting them more than out in the rural areas. But these people, the fact of life in Africa is that there is a close connection between urban and rural, great interchange, so it is spreading in the rural areas as well. It is devastating. Now, what does it mean for Africa? I would, one can throw around numbers, and I don't like to do it, but I think it's quite a conservative figure is that probably before the end of this century, about 10 million Africans will die of AIDS. What can the West do? It seems to me that although we are spending a good deal of money, as are other Western countries, on distribution of condoms, which we have done for many years as part of family planning programs, the task, the numbers needed, the distribution system needed, and also cultural barriers to the utilization are so great. I don't think that is going to have much effect. There are efforts in Africa, as there are here, but more so in Africa, on vaccine testing, and I think with the cooperation of various African countries, and I think that's the hope. The birth rate, what's interesting is that even with this death, this 10 million death, the population of Africa will continue to go up because the birth rate in so many countries is so relatively high. But, as I say, the productive element of the society is more affected by AIDS than by productive. I don't mean to suggest that somebody who works in the field all day is not productive, but those elements within the cash economy are more seriously affected, and that will have an impact in countries that are heavily impacted on their economic development.
With respect to the aid figure which you mentioned of $800 million, would you comment on how that's divided up among nations, what priorities are used, and what kind of accountability there is?
Yeah. Well, let me handle the accountability question first, because it's obviously a question of significance to people who work in government, not only because we pay taxes, but if things get terribly messed up, we can wind up spending time in Leavenworth, and so it has a greater immediacy, perhaps, to the answerer of the question than the person who posed it. I think, generally speaking, we pay pretty close attention to how our funds are spent in Africa and around the world. There is very little check writing. It's usually projectized aid. It is aid which is, because of this, highly labor intensive. It costs us a lot to deliver aid. Why? Because we tend to have a lot of people in the field watching how the aid is administered. We have a lot of contractors, American contractors. Many of the universities in this area have people out in Africa doing various kinds of contracting. Could be agricultural research or implementation of agricultural programs or other such things. So I don't want to sound like a complacent civil servant. It's a problem. I suspect there is seepage. I suspect there is loss, definitely corruption, but I think we keep it to manageable proportions, and I think we do a better job than any other country or international agency. How is it decided what African country gets what? Well, basically the decisions are done on the basis of how well these countries will utilize the aid. Also, it's done on the basis of how great the need is. In each year, or actually several years in advance, our Agency for International Development comes up with a plan, a budget, which is then hashed over ad nauseum within the government, within the executive branch, and then submitted to Congress. And when this $800 million figure is asked for from Congress, it isn't a lump sum. It is $15 million for this country, and Congressman, if you turn to Annex 22, you'll see exactly what projects that's going to be spent on. And the sum total comes to $800 million, sometimes less, sometimes more. Increasingly, we are looking at the topic of democracy and governance as an element in our aid apportioning decisions. Not so much to reward those countries that are going the right way in terms of democracy, but rather because we recognize that democratic societies are likely to be the most efficient utilizers of aid, because there's likely to be less government corruption, likely to be less cronyism, likely to be a more spirited debate within the society on how assistance should be spent. Let me add that we are not, by the way, the largest aid donors in Africa, not by a long shot. The International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, of course, we contribute a significant share to what they give, are very large donors. The European community as a whole is much larger than we are, and individual European states in their bilateral aid are very large too. For instance, again, in Zambia, which is a country we had good relations with and a lot of interest, I think we were about number 9 in terms of aid donors, with the Italians, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and others giving more. But I will say this, because we tend to put more people in the field, because we don't write blank checks, our aid officials are more listened to by host government officials than I think the donors or the civil servants of any other country. And aid, if you've been reading the press, has gotten a pretty bad rap. I think there have been allegations of corruption and what have you. Yes, I'm sure there has been. But I think they do better than anyone else, and I think they do fairly well. The problem, I must say, and I'm sorry to go on at length, but it is something that energizes me. We really ought to take a new look at our aid programs, because right now the law which governs aid lists something like 30 specific priority areas that every aid receiving country has got to participate in. Or let me put that the other way. If we're giving aid overseas to country X, we're not only worried about maternal and child health, we've got to be concerned about AIDS, we've got to be concerned about developing indigenous business, we've got to be, and within that we've got to make sure that a certain percentage goes to developing businesses run by women. And none of these ideas are bad. They're all good. But we spread ourselves too thinly. We have so much law, so much regulation, that I don't think we're doing our job as well as we could. And I'd like to see somebody go in and take the aid legislation, which, by the way, I cannot get my hand around now, and just rip it apart and start over again.
With respect to your criteria for aid, how sensitive are we to imposing additional problems upon the African culture, the displacement of the rural family into the city being the example?
Well, the Great Migration in Africa, which is the same as the migration throughout the world from rural to urban areas, is not a product of aid. It's a product of a natural inclination, and as desperate as a slum in Kenya, in Nairobi, or Bogota, or Bangkok may appear to us, it is nevertheless a locus of opportunity to somebody coming from a rural area. There may be electricity, there may be a chance to send a kid to school. There's certainly more of a chance for remunerated income, or remunerated work than there is in the countryside. So I think, I'm not putting words in your mouth, if you were suggesting that people are coming into African capitals and creating an urban underclass because of aid, I don't think that's the question. But I do think that you're onto something, and I have seen good aid programs develop in which we work with governments to try to create growth points outside of the capitals. That is, take let's say a provincial or district village and encourage the government to encourage people in turn to build factories there, or build a decent school out there so a man doesn't have to bring his entire family into the city to get them education. So we are aware of the necessity of promoting aid that disperses population, or at least slows down the urban movement. But I really do think in reality, it's probably a lost cause. I mean, if you look at our own country, the movement from rural areas to urban areas is only now, in this decade, starting to reverse itself as all the yuppies go out into, way out into the countryside, probably 15 miles from Baltimore. But I don't think that's going to be significant. I think the future of the world is an urban future, and we're just going to have to work around it.
Would you comment upon the quality of the bureaucrats within African countries?
It's uneven, but it's certainly much better than it was 30 years ago. Yesterday I was at a meeting which was sponsored by a group called the African American Institute, which is the premier organization in the United States promoting private assistance to Africa. But basically most of its funding comes through various kinds of AID projects. And the speaker made the point that AAI has now brought to this country and trained up through master's degree level 2,500 Africans. That's a significant number. It's not a large number for the whole continent, but that's been done elsewhere in Europe, what have you. And of course, there are universities in Africa. The problem in Africa, I think, is not so much the basic competence of civil servants, but the political culture that exists. And if that political culture sees a job in government as a way of ripping off other people, as a way of getting the 10% or the 20%, then that is horribly corrosive in a society. And in an autocratic society in which there's no democratic opposition, that kind of corruption can continue. At least in a democratic society, it may continue, but every few years you get to clean house and throw the bums out, and that has a salutary effect. I'm making no.
Would you expand upon your optimism towards South Africa?
I think that there's a good chance. I think there's a good chance for a variety of reasons. One, it is clear that both sides in that conflict have essentially recognized that their positions that they held fervently as little as 2 or 3 years ago are bankrupt. The black revolutionaries recognize that they are not going to unseat in a military way the government of South Africa. It's just too strong. And keep in mind that there are in South Africa, you have a white community there of 4 or 5 million people, which is probably as big as Denmark or Israel or what have you. So there is a force there to be reckoned with. It's not, for instance, as in Rhodesia, where the white population was never more than 1.5% or 2% of the population. At its highest number was 100 or 200,000. And there is a general acceptance among the African leadership. And indeed, there has been for many years, but they couldn't express it because they were locked up in the clink, that negotiation is the way to go. And at the same time, I think there's a general recognition among white leadership that apartheid is dead. That kind of control that was exercised can no longer survive. Now, that doesn't mean there's agreement, because there's a lot of disagreement on what will replace the system, with the white government seeking to hold on to as much power, now basically veto power, in any new political configuration, and the African majority saying, well, wait a minute, why don't we have a government just like the one we had before? All those provisions, no, not the provisions of racial exclusivism and oppression, but why don't we just have the same kind of government? And there's a tension there, and that's what's being negotiated right now. And I think it's going to work. It's going to be a long, bumpy road, and even after there is a political settlement, there's going to be tremendous tension in South Africa for our lifetimes. The negotiation will be a daily event, because the inequities in that society are so great that there's going to have to be a lot of change, and that's going to be very difficult to manage, and there's going to be a lot of tension. But I think it can be done.
Would you comment upon population growth in Africa and its implications?
It varies. Population growth varies greatly from country to country. Interestingly, when we were talking about urbanization before, population growth tends to go down with urbanization. Families have fewer children. They feel the need for fewer children. They're not working land anymore. They want to be able to send their children to school. You have to pay to send your kid to school, or at least buy a uniform. So, as elsewhere in the world, the greater the urbanization, the lower the population rate. But overall in Africa, there is a high population growth rate. In some countries, between 3% and 4% a year, which is very high. In Kenya, it was at one point about 3.6%. Zimbabwe, where I served, it was about that as well. And there are real cultural problems, not problems, they're factors that we just have to deal with, that children are prized in Africa, that a large number of children die, therefore big families are common. I remember going out once and meeting a group of women who were involved in family planning, in going door to door in rural Zimbabwe. And this was the rural elite. It was quite carefully, it was the wife of the local school teacher, the wife of the local garage owner, and they were a very sharp group of women, although basically not with formal education. And they all told me that they thought that the average family, which in that area, women would have during their lifetime 8 to 10 births. Not all those children would survive, that was excessive, and I nodded in agreement. And they said they thought 5 or 6 would be much better. And And that's how things go, slowly and slowly. Now, the ecological implication of growing populations is obvious. As more and more pressure on the land develops, there's less land for African wildlife. It has been a major factor in the decimation of the elephant population. The rhino population has been almost entirely destroyed, but not because of population, but because of greed and poaching. And to a degree, that's happened with elephants as well.
Would you paint a picture of religious variety within Africa?
Yeah, there is a great variety in Africa, and it differs from country to country. In much of southern Africa and eastern Africa, the predominant religion is Christianity. There is a long tradition first of a missionary tradition in Africa, and now indigenous churches of all stripes, Catholic and Protestant. A large percentage of Africa, I think, has not adopted Western religion or non-indigenous religion, and many Africans stick to their own religion, although there is a high correlation between urbanization, education, and adoption of either Christianity or Islam. In West Africa and North Africa, the majority of people are Muslims. And this is and these are long-established communities. Islam came to East Africa, or to Somalia and Sudan, and then to West Africa very early on in the 7th, 8th, 9th century through traders. One of the issues that's of interest to us is that as a nation, we, of course, do not oppose Islam. It's a fundamental world religion. What is worrying is the growth of Islamic fundamentalism in several African states, and in one in particular, Sudan, where the north is essentially Muslim, south is essentially Christian, and fundamentalism has taken hold in the north, and they are trying to prescribe and indeed enforce Islam on the Christian south, and therefore there's a civil war going on. But no, the pattern of religion in Africa is very varied, and it provides a very important part of African culture.
For a very rich and full and thoroughly enjoyable evening, we thank you very much.